Hi, everyone. A change of locations and a very special guest to join us. So, thanks so much for joining Weekly Notice with Andy Ngo. And here I have a wonderful colleague joining me as the first in person guest for Weekly Notice. This is Libby Emmons, the editor in chief of the Post Millennial. So, this is the incredible woman who works day in and day out to make sure that the website gets the content up that many of you readers like to read. And Libby, thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest on my show. And I just want to say to also being a very good friend and mentor to me.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind.
So
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, wow. I always say this, but it's a surprise to me that it's only been a week since the last show because it's mind blowing how much happens in just 7 days in like my small niche of the news stuff that I work on. And we Post Millennial just published a report that has a lot of exclusive reporting from me, and I worked with a local reporter in San Diego named Ava Knott. So we're going to discuss that right now. You all may recall that I've talked about a case happened in San Diego County last year. So in December, the district attorney in San Diego brought felony charges of conspiracy, rioting, a whole bunch of other charges against 11 alleged members of an Antifa cell belonging to two cells actually in LA and in the San Diego area. The prosecutors last December had alleged that they had conspired and worked together to carry out a really brutal attack on Trump supporters at Pacific Beach in San Diego. So that was December of last year. There were charges from the prosecutor's office. Well, during this time, in the month since, we found out on Tuesday this week that last month a secret grand jury had met over 13 days and was presented evidence. So here are the photos of some of the suspects. And if you had read some of the other reporting that just came out about this grand jury indictment, you'll see that they didn't publish photos of the suspects. So through a lot of investigation months ago, I was able to find and to get these suspect photos, which is actually really important because usually we have no idea in many jurisdictions what some of these Antifa suspects look like because the photos aren't released by the prosecutors. So long story short, in January of last year, there was a pro-Trump rally at Pacific Beach in San Diego, and Antifa responded by gathering a cell from LA and San Diego to go and attack these people. And I'll play videos and kind of see a little bit of an idea. There weren't very many videos that were recorded. Some of the stuff that was out by some of the pro-Antifa journalists ended up being deleted, but this video is still up. So, yeah, you can see that the first attack here was people using pepper spray to target people. You can see that the Antifa had their flags, they had bats. And the attack just went on and on. And the violence is actually much longer than this 45-second video. At times it was actually indiscriminate, and innocent people were assaulted. Especially on a bicycle, there was a journalist there who was assaulted. So what's really big about this case is that there are felony charges of conspiracy. And this is one of the suspects. The co-author on this report, Ava Knott, she sat in on the court, and the judge addressed this person by Mr. Yach, that's his name, and in the arrest warrant for this individual is listed as male, but this individual corrected the person and said Miss and proclaimed that she's transgender. the judge did not allow photographs of the suspects during the hearing, by the way, which is why these photos are published here in this way, rather not from the courtroom, but rather from other research and investigation that I did months ago. Jesse Cannon, I reported on this individual just the other month, also with Abe Venant for the San Diego Reader. What's significant about this person is that he is alleged to be in a relationship with this woman named Leah Madback, and she is a staffer who works for the public defender's office in San Diego. So I wrote a story about how the prosecutor in San Diego had actually petitioned the court to not allow some of the discovery to be released to the defendant's side because there was evidence that they believed that this individual, Jesse Cannon, had run some of these Twitter Antifa accounts and were trying to intimidate some of the witnesses. Yet another suspect here, Luis Francisco Mora. I'm going to go through the photos. It's really important for you to see. One of the signs they had at this, before it became a violent riot, the Antifa held a sign that said Ashley Babbitt deserved it. And Ashley Babbitt was the unarmed woman who was climbing through the window during the January 6th riot at the Capitol and was shot dead by police. So for all that Antifa say that they're against police brutality, police killings, no, they're actually quite for it as long as their political opponents are getting killed. And actually they would like to be the ones to pull the trigger. Another suspect, Faraz Martin Talab. He's this individual with the lighter face covering in the middle. Jeremy Jonathan White. This is a photograph from a court document that was scanned. That's why the quality is very bad. Brian Cortez Lightfoot Jr. And these are photos of some of the prosecutors in the courtroom. So, Libby, as I'm sharing with you all this, how do you feel when we hear over and over that say Antifa doesn't exist?
Yeah, I think that's crazy. But I saw your testimony before Congress a few years ago I thought was very telling. I read your book. I also have been following the reporting that you've been doing. I've been seeing so many of the street protests. Last summer, there was so much evidence that, of course, this group exists. I think what's so interesting about Antifa and other far left groups today is that they basically operate as leaderless enterprises, which makes it so easy to say that you don't exist because you're a hydra. And when one head is cut off, another one just springs up in its place. We're seeing that with other kinds of groups that are forming now too, that when you operate in this way and you have this loose connection, but you just share your views and your plans, anyone can join in and be part of this group. You can self-identify into it.
Exactly. That actually connects then to the next thing I'm going to bring out. The big news that happened in the last 48 hours is that in San Francisco, the voters overwhelmingly voted to recall the prosecutor, Chesa Boudin. Background, Chesa Boudin in 2019 was elected during the campaign. He essentially laid out his vision, which is that the criminal justice system is systemically racist and that it would be his goal as a progressive to sort of right the wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that is we've had an increase in violent crimes in San Francisco. Some of them have been high profile, many really brazen robberies and thefts that would happen at stores, at businesses in ethnic East Asian areas, brutal assaults on Asian people who are in the daylight. And the prosecutor's office was systematically not go easy on those who would get arrested, and with the intention to see that these violent criminals are not in jail. To try to equalize racially.
They tried to make it okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so they would refuse to prosecute criminals. But we would see this evidence, and then criminals would get brought in, they would get arrested, and then just released. In so many cases, in our big cities, we have this what they call bail reform, which basically means you don't need bail to just be released. You're released on your own recognizance. And the idea has been that you would only get bail for something like violent crimes. We have stuff like that in New York, that's been in Los Angeles, and it completely dismisses the fact that if you went over and over for committing crimes, they're going to keep committing those crimes.
Well, you have a lot of connections to these places that have either from places that are now under district attorneys whose campaigns were benefited from Soros money through super PACs, or those who are connected to Soros.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, you spent time. You lived in Philadelphia before.
Sure,
you live in New York City now,
yeah.
And both of the prosecutors in those places during their campaigns received a lot of money from the Soros-funded PACs.
Yeah, and they're both absolutely terrible, and they don't seem to care what happens to citizens who are following the law. So we have a situation, it's called a narco-tyranny, where regular citizens...
It's a great word.
Yeah, regular citizens have to follow these laws, and when you break the laws, you are prosecuted for them. But if you're a criminal, the law doesn't seem to apply to you. We have this two-tiered system of justice where it's only those who are willing to follow the law that have to abide by it, and everybody else can do as they please. And it's in New York too. We saw this with the change in the way that small crimes were prosecuted, or small infractions. So now it's like if you jump a turnstile and you don't pay your $2.75 to get on the subway, people just let you off. It's no big deal. That happens in Washington, D.C. as well, which I've heard from some of our local reporters there.
What's to tell you that 60% of San Francisco residents voted to recall Chesa Boudin, and that surprised me actually, because I mean it's double digits, 20%. That's really huge. Chesa Boudin in his interviews have gone on to blame right-wing billionaire funders who he accuses of supporting the campaign effort to recall him. By the way, the campaign to keep him against the recall effort receives funding from a George Soros-funded political action committee.
What's so interesting is after we ran a report about Boudin's recall, we said, Soros-backed DA recalled. We got email from Soros's attorney saying that Boudin was not funded by George Soros, even though everyone knows that he put money in, through like little channels. So we changed it to say that donors affiliated with Soros, backed him.
I find it interesting now that Soros is directing his counsel to write to various small news publications to essentially try to...
It wasn't just us either. It was a lot of small outlets.
It seems like he's viewing this defeat of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, I think, as... Well, one is humiliating for Boudin, but supporters of Boudin are also humiliated, and it seems like this is a way to sort of try to distance himself. I'm going to pull up...
Yeah, and he wants to retain his power. And he can't do that if he's going to lose. San Francisco also just recently recalled 3 members of their school board, saying that they didn't want progressive members of the school board as well, who had spent most of the pandemic not trying to open schools or make sure that kids were getting an education in San Francisco, which they weren't, but trying to change the names of schools so that they weren't reflective of people that they didn't like. They were trying to pull Dianne Feinstein's name off of school, if I recall correctly. She's a sitting representative from California.
In the analysis post the recall, successful recall of Boudin, I hope there's more that people take into consideration what can happen when Asian Americans mobilize. As a voting bloc, generally that's an ethnic group that's been quite ignored by both Democrats and Republicans for a number of reasons. Asian population is small compared to, let's say, Black or Latinos. and Asian Americans are viewed as generally not really able to swing states or swing big elections. So, Republicans don't really care to try to go to win over their votes. Whereas, you see they put a lot of effort and to get black and Republican votes and Democrats as well. Because, but here in California, I think how a lot of the Asian Americans have mobilized was actually through uh, these chat services that were in Chinese.
Oh, that's
And
interesting. I didn't know that.
and that was also done by the same for those on the school board.
In the school board.
Yeah, and I mean, because the school board, one of the people, what's it called when the person serves on school board? School board member, counselor.
You're
Yeah, whatever that title is. I remember one of them, I forget her name, a woman, but she made a lot of really anti-Asian racist posts on her social media.
It was sort of shocking to read what she had said about Asian parents. Asian parents are also mobilizing in New York because the city is essentially targeting Asian students by pulling back on gifted and talented programs and pulling back on accelerated academic programs. We have a very large Chinese immigrant population, Asian immigrant population, and their students have been doing very well in these schools and in these programs. And for some reason, the city thinks it's bad if Asians are excelling in schools.
So hold that for a moment. What I'm trying to understand is, so in New York City there are state public schools that some of them have disproportionate Asian American students because these are also, you have to apply to get into them.
Right.
But they're public schools.
You have to test in and all of this. We have 5 extremely high performing academic schools. Stuyvesant, Bronx Science among them.
So it doesn't matter if you live next to the school, you have to apply.
You have to get
into
these schools. Yeah. And these are excellent schools to the point where many Nobel Prize winners graduate from these schools. And from my view, as a New Yorker and as an American and someone who wants our country to be successful, I don't care what the skin color is or the ethnic background of the person who is going to succeed academically and win Nobel Prizes and discover great things. I'm thrilled that we have this kind of talent in our city, and I think we should be supporting it regardless of the race of the students. And we saw at Lowell, I think in San Francisco, which is an elite school, I think they, if I remember correctly, they opened it up to lottery. And you have a number of students who then ended up at Lowell and are not able to achieve at the same academic level. And so the test scores and the grades are dropping at Lowell. They're rising at other schools where all of these students have had to, spread out. But why are we taking away from these academically achieving students?
So you living in New York City, you're surrounded by a lot of New York leftists and liberals. Can you, and I mean, part of like some of the beats that you focus on in your column writing, your reporting relates a lot to education. I mean, I first heard of you, I think, well, I started paying a lot of attention to you several years ago because you were writing about the curriculum stuff that you saw in your son's public school.
That's right.
Brooklyn. So if you were to steelman the side of those who are pushing this type of race CRT perspective in the curriculums, why do you think they view disproportionate Asian American presence as sort of a threat to their worldview and ideology and utopia?
I have to say that I can't figure that out. It doesn't make any sense to me. When families immigrate to the U.S. and they land in Brooklyn and their students are, their kids are American, I don't understand at all why anyone would want to bar any American students from, achieving their full potential for any reason at all. I find it absolutely perplexing, and so do, I think, so many of the Asian families and many Black families and many white families. This is sort of universally derided, these ideas that are being pushed in. Because if you have a kid who is not academically achieving and they are suddenly lottoed into some school with a bunch of high academic achievers, they're going to fall behind and feel bad about themselves and lose confidence. Why are we doing that? It's almost as though we believe that there's only one way to be successful and that everyone has to be successful in that exact same way. And that if you're not successful in that exact same way, we have to push you into it, even if that's not your jam. You know, my son is very musically gifted. I push him into being musically gifted. Some of his friends are not, so their parents aren't pushing him to be that. But should everybody be pushing their kids in the exact same way? It's ridiculous. There are so many different kinds of educations, and there's so many different ways to succeed in life, financially, emotionally, all of these ways. There's not just one thing. And I don't think it's reasonable to do this to the kids who don't succeed or the kids who do succeed.
I hope that Asian Americans mobilize more, particularly after what they've been experiencing in places like New York City and San Francisco, where they are unfortunately quite often the victims of these social experiments in criminal justice changes, as well as changes in the education system. I hope that this ignored demographic bloc in America becomes like a sleeping tiger that's awakened. And back to Chester Boudin, when one talks about him, I think it's important to also contextualize like who he is, his upbringing. He's not just a former progressive district attorney, but he once worked as a translator for who was it in Venezuela? Let me look through my notes.
And also, his parents were terrorists.
I was going to get to that. He was a translator for Hugo Chavez.
Right.
So, okay, like on his own record, he's been openly sympathetic to Marxist ideologies and views to the point that he would work as a translator for the head of state for a socialist country. But that's not. So that's on him, and then his upbringing, as Libby just mentioned, and I'm always shocked when By the way, I'm in the UK now, as many of you know, and when I tell British friends that we have an elected official in one of the biggest cities in America whose parents were convicted terrorists, and he was adopted by members of that same communist terrorist group that his parents belonged to. So Chester Boudin's biological parents are Kathy Boudin and David Gilbert. Both of them were involved in a deadly attempted bank robbery / terrorist attack in 1981 in New York State that resulted in 3 people being murdered. They were members of the Weather Underground, which then became there was an offshoot group called the May 19th Communist Organization. They were working with the another black communist group, and so they had men armed with rifles and guns carrying out. And by the way, throughout the 70s, the Weather Underground were involved in a number of bombings and jailbreaks, and these were the type of attacks that they were carrying out. And so both of Chester Boudin's parents were convicted and sent to prison for a number of years. Kathy Boudin, when she was released, I think her sentence was 20 years, if I recall, something in that area. She became an academic. David Gilbert was imprisoned all the way until, was it this year or last year? He was pardoned by
that's right.
former Governor Andrew Cuomo,
right?
Like literally in the last hours before he left office. Remember Andrew Cuomo?
Before he was pushed out by far leftists.
He had to resign in disgrace because of all the.
And then they never prosecuted him for any of the any of the, their vague charges of him doing like vaguely weird things.
So
Yeah.
Chessa's not at fault for the views of his terrorist parents. He was then adopted by Bernadette Dorn, who at one point was an FBI most wanted terrorist,
Hmm.
and Bill Ayers.
Right.
Both of them were members of the Weather Underground, again, a violent domestic terrorist communist group in the 70s and early 80s that carried out a number of bombings that resulted in people being injured and dying. Um, and to this day, by the way, even though Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn are after after allegedly leaving terrorism behind and becoming academics, they've never disavowed. Bill Ayers, in particular, on record, when was asked in an interview by Megyn Kelly a number of years ago, asked if he would disavow those views, he wouldn't.
Hmm.
And so Chessa was, from the crib, just marinated in this type of upbringing, and he's brought it until that type of worldview until his role as a politician and prosecutor. But do you think that this recall result is? Do you think the other um, district attorneys that are of his sort of similar political milieu and have some way benefited from Soros money or Soros affiliate money, do you think this is a wake up call for them, or do you think?
No,
Why do you say
no,
that?
I don't think it's a wake up call for them because they fully believe in their ideology. They think that what they are doing is the right and correct thing to do. And they're going to keep doing it, whether they're in office or, recalled. George Gascon in Los Angeles is doing a disaster of a job with that city. And he doesn't seem at all concerned about that. Earlier, I think was it earlier this year, he actually, through his office, a man who was in his 20s who identified as trans after he was arrested uh, was convicted on sexually molesting a 10-year-old girl when he was 16. And then, because the DA's office did not move to have him tried as an adult, because he had been a juvenile at the time of the incident, he was sentenced to a juvenile facility for the crime of having sexually molested a little girl. And there was some question for a while if he would be sentenced to a girls' juvenile facility because he identified as trans after he was arrested. That's insane. And Gascon spoke about it at the time, and he was like, oh, no, after backlash, he said, no, it shouldn't be like that. But it took all of that, and it took the judge saying, oh, I'm going to go along with your policy. This is what you have. I'm going to go along with it. Even though the judge in the case seemed to believe that it was ridiculous as well. Gascon hasn't changed his ways.
Kim Fox, by the way, you see in this picture, Kim Fox, she's the prosecutor in Chicago, Illinois, and she was the one who did not want to prosecute the now convicted hate crime hoaxer Justice Smollett back in 2019. So because she had so mishandled that case, I mean, she did it so badly that a different another prosecuting office had to take over, and because she didn't want to bring charges against him, I think she was friends with his family, and yeah, I think back to a number of years ago when I was just so naive about the politics in America. I really thought that those who are corrupt and carry out corrupt acts in public or private would face consequences, and you just see over and over. No, it doesn't work like that. And I think what made it so clear to me, like literally in front of me, was like in Portland in 2020 when there were months of violence by the far left, by Antifa, by Black Lives Matter supporters, attacks on police, attack on civilians, attack on private residences, on the federal courthouse. And the new prosecutor who came in at that time, Mike Schmidt, just announced this new policy. I think less than a week into when he came in office, that those accused of who are charged with all these crimes by police, that his office won't prosecute, like resisting arrest, escaping.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's insane. It's absolutely insane. And what we saw going on in Portland, I remember we were keeping a tally. And it was like 100 nights of straight rioting passed.
120.
110 nights passed, and then we got to 120. It was absolutely astounding to see this kind of violence night after night be just brushed under the rug as though it were just no big deal to destroy cities like this. And in all of these cities where we've seen this kind of violence, we've seen the cities go from, and I can feel it in New York, the power dynamic in the street has shifted, right? It just feels different to walk down the streets of New York than it did, in February 2020, before everything really started to go straight down the drain. But in all of these cities, life has gotten worse for the law-abiding citizens of these locations. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Philadelphia.
Anarcho-tyranny.
Anarcho-tyranny. Philadelphia, we just had this mass shooting at a place where I used to hang out in high school right there all the time. I would go to the diner. I would
Hold that thought.
Oh, okay.
So I want to remind those who maybe joined a little late, please ask questions or give good comments. Type it in right now during this live stream. We'll get to it soon. And this is Libby Emmons, the editor-in-chief of the Post, first in-person guest.
Very exciting.
A friend of mine. So sorry for interruption.
No.
So yeah, some of us may have saw that video, the mass shooting in Philadelphia, where just before the shooting, you see like hundreds of people on the street, and they included a lot of children and very young people, just getting into brawls. Right. When I saw that, I've only been to Philadelphia once or twice, I think only once, so I don't know at all.
That's where we met.
That's right. A few years ago at a conference. But I assumed from the videos that where the mass shooting happened, 3 people were killed and at least 12 injured, by the way. And by the way, I'm sure you all noticed that was covered quite differently by the press. And the reason for that is the demographics of the victims.
Well, and because it was not ideologically based, right? But it doesn't appear to be that.
When a violence carried out for a left-wing ideology, that's also brushed over.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's true.
So anyway, my question is, when I saw these videos and the people that were injured and were involved in the brawls, I think is entirely a black crowd. So I assume that this was in the hood or in a rough part, and maybe let me know it's not. So tell me about that area where that mass shooting happened.
So Center City, Philadelphia is the downtown area. It's sort of this square. It's between the 2 rivers, the Delaware River and the Schuylkill River, between sort of Spring Garden Street on the north and South Street on the south. And then you go into South Philadelphia, which is a much more residential neighborhood. There's a fair amount of ghetto in Philadelphia. South Street is not one of those areas. South Street is an area where everybody goes to hang out. There's a lot of nightlife. There's a lot of really cool little shops and boutiques. There's fun little bars. There's a couple great, when I'm there's a great record shop, the Philadelphia Record Exchange. There's a great old bookshop where I get all my weird old books that I still read. It's a place where teenagers go to hang out and adults go to hang out.
So did something change in recent years where the crowds there and that type of lawlessness of people just fighting like all over the streets, and there were children?
There were children. I would say the last time I actually hung out on South Street was probably when we were in town in 2019, and I took my whole post-millennial crew from Canada down to South Street, and we went to a couple of bars and we hung out and had a great time. And it has changed. I've heard from friends locally, they don't hang out down there anymore. They don't tend to hang out downtown as much as they used to. There's a lot more violence and crime. And it just, the difference really is about how safe you feel walking around the street. Used to be in Philly, I would walk home the bars close at 2. I'd walk home a little after 2. Wouldn't feel like it was a big deal at all. Walk home to friends' houses or whatever. Didn't feel like it was an issue. The last time I did that, I would say, was in August of this past year, and it felt weird. And I was like, I'm halfway back. I don't know if I should be walking by myself right now. It felt weird. There was a lot of strange stuff going on was very disconcerting.
The left focuses on feelings and experiences a lot because it's actually very important, and the right tends to dismiss it. But like how an individual group of people feel, I mean that's why terrorists carry out attacks, right? They want people to feel like they're unsafe in public at any moment, and um, it is potent and it's powerful, and it changes the way society interacts, or how people interact with one another. I mean, if in London, for example, there have been so many jihadist attacks that all over in the central part, in really beautiful areas. Unfortunately, there are these really ugly street barriers that are all over. And over time, you just sort of get accustomed to it. But really, like, I don't think that is a. So I'm quoting the Mayor Sadiq Khan in response when he was responding to all the terrorist attacks. That's just how life is, because there are many cities and parts of the world. I mean, just thinking Tokyo, Seoul, Warsaw, Krakow, or Budapest, where the central parts of the cities don't have all these barriers that are there to essentially stop people from carrying out terrorist attacks using their cars. Which
We have barriers like that in New York City. And they're
yes,
hideous.
they are.
Yeah.
But how do you then, that feeling that you said where you can feel the change when you're walking through in the public in these other places on the East Coast. I'll, to be honest, if I am spending time in New York City alone, I think I would be a little bit afraid. I think people of East Asian descent are sometimes seen as easy prey for criminals. And unfortunately, because we don't have a lot of political representation when there are attacks, there's not really this huge public backlash at all, which is really sad and angering to me, by the way, when you see these videos of shop owners or elderly people getting beaten and robbed. And some of them may have a language barrier, but a lot of them just aren't politically connected, so they don't know to what organizations to contact. Whereas, certain other groups that leftists outreach to, they're so willing to amplify any story that quite often they amplify hoaxes. But my question for you, Libby, though, how would you respond if somebody, let's say on the left, to say, well, facts don't care about your feelings, just because you feel unsafe in parts of New York or Brooklyn, that doesn't mean it's actually unsafe?
I think you'd have to walk around and get that feeling for yourself and try and understand it. New York, after a couple of terms of Rudy Giuliani, who really did a lot of cracking down on crime, which I remember very distinctly because I was in the city at the time. And you no longer got offers of people trying to sell you drugs in Washington Square Park. It happened very quickly that like you'd walk through Washington Square and people would be like, weed, coke, whatever. And then suddenly that just wasn't happening. It was very sudden. I got that changed after he had a couple of terms, and then Mayor Michael Bloomberg came in. He had 3 terms, oddly, which was approved by City Council. But the city was not just safe; it was shockingly safe. It was the safest big city in the U.S. It was so comfortable. It was so easy. And yes, I'm speaking from a distinctly middle class perspective. Walking around with my friends and in the middle of the night, going out, doing whatever, hanging around. It felt very safe. I didn't have an issue taking the subway home at 2 a.m. Um, you know, I did that routinely, and now I don't at all. As a matter of fact, I don't go out if I don't feel like I have the money to pay an excessively priced Uber to get all the way home. Because also Ubers have destroyed the taxi industry, so that's a whole different issue. But if I can't pay $80 to get home in the middle of the night with a car, then I'm not going to go out, and that's brand new.
There's been
over the past couple of years, anyway.
There's been a lot of violence that has happened in the New York subway, the metro. Like there was that mass shooting
that
happened
right near my house.
Yes, I was in Brooklyn. That Asian American woman by Times Square that was shoved into the train and died.
Yeah, is the young woman who was shot in her apartment. She was followed into downtown. She was a graphic designer, I believe. She was
The
also
Asian American.
Asian. Yeah. She was followed into her apartment by a homeless man and brutally killed.
So, should if I'm visiting New York City, should I be afraid to take the metro?
Uh, I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
if you're afraid to take it, you kind of take it anyway. The
Out of necessity.
Out of necessity, leaving my neighborhood, the stop where that mass shooting was, I go through there frequently if I'm on the subway. And every time I go through, I think about it and I think about how that man's gun jammed and what if his gun hadn't jammed. When I'm
Mm.
standing on a subway platform, I put my back up against a pillar or the wall and I don't leave any space between me and a surface so that I can't be pushed onto the tracks. You'd have to pull me onto the tracks the way that I stand on a subway platform. I'm very careful. I don't sit by the door on the subway. I either stand in the corner or I sit like in the middle of the train car. Whereas it used to be my favorite seat was right by the door because you could get off fast. Now I don't do that because I don't want someone jumping on and like being all crazy, taking my stuff, being stabby. We've seen some stuff like this as well.
There's so many videos of the metro of the New York Metro where there's like assaults or sexual assaults that are happening
Mm-hmm.
just in the train, and people just sort of. I don't know if they're numb to it, but they look like it's
Oh, you get
treated
kind of,
as routine.
it's pretty weird. I mean, even before all of this, like I was sitting on the subway one time and I noticed some bizarre action next to me, the man sitting next to me. And I got up. There was something weird going on, and I can say what it was, but I got out of my chair and I moved away. I was on the subway over the summer. I was actually trying to get to a radio interview with Jesse Kelly, and I was on the subway, and I was like, if I were stuck in the tunnel, it's going to be terrible. And then I realized there was a crazy man running up and down through the subway tunnel with a knife trying to get on the train. And then a whole bunch of police officers got on the train, and like 12 of them, and they started running back and forth through the subway, through the full subway, and literally saying to passengers, which way did he go? Like it was a Bugs Bunny cartoon. And we were all just like, this is insane. This is just crazy. And meanwhile, the man is still running around outside, coming up to the windows, being like, ah. They eventually, the train moved. I don't know what happened.
I have to say, so London is a very big city and has a very expensive, massive subway system as well, and there's no comparable level of violence that you see in the subway system compared to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
One big difference, though, is the law enforcement presence in London is very you see it everywhere, and I don't know. There's also it's hard for me to pin. Everybody kind of has a theory for why there's so much violence in the United States, and I don't know. Maybe it's not helpful to opine because there's so many variables. But now that I spent some time outside the U.S. and from city to city, and you're just seeing the type of violent criminality that happens in places that where it shouldn't happen. Every place will have the odd insane or violent extremist person who carries out a random attack, these people who are lone wolves, but like these sort of a system where you have all these things that you just described in one city, and it's not the experience of every big city, by the way. I yeah,
It wasn't our experience up to 2 years ago. The city was just, I mean, shockingly safe from something like 98, 99 through 2020.
Mm.
And then once you had people who were people off the streets, you had people going home, you had a lot of people who left the city and went to their summer houses, like a lot of rich people just left. You had police, you had a lot less police presence in the subway. You had an increase in homelessness. You had an increase in homeless people on the subway because there were less police on the subway enforcing things. You had more enforcement of things like masks and vaccine mandates than you did, subway problems. So the focus shifted to target law-abiding citizens who weren't doing their job to stop the spread. I remember distinctly people getting arrested on the ferry for refusing to wear their masks. It's like this, it's so stupid. It's just so stupid.
So I opened up this episode of Weekly Notice talking about the story that I co-wrote that was just published on the Post Millennial about the San Diego secret grand jury indictment against suspected members of an Antifa cell in Los Angeles and San Diego. And one thing you said earlier, Libby, by the way, is that the way that Antifa organized makes it so that by design makes it so that they kind of have a plausible deniability about their existence. And it's a really effective tactic. We segue into talking about Chesa Boudin and his parents. So the far left's tactics have changed significantly from the heydays of when far left groups were carrying out terrorist attacks. In I would say probably one of the biggest differences is that those who were part of the Black Liberation Army, the Weather Underground, these other and numerous similar communist terrorist groups, these were groups that had like memberships and were structured as like an organization. And so when the FBI targeted them and prosecuted, and they were prosecuted, they were jailed, they were able to bring down the entire group. The far left today, for a number of years now, have realized that they can be much more effective by giving off this image that they aren't actually a group. Mm-hmm. So Antifa do that really well, and now we're seeing it in a different line of far left attacks in the form of violent attacks on pregnancy resource centers.
That's been interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So ever since the leaking of the draft Roe v. Wade opinion, those on the far left have called for, encouraged, and indeed have carried out a number of attacks on pregnancy resource centers and churches of numerous Christian denominations, by the way. Mm-hmm. Sorry about that sound. And then just yesterday, there was a case out of Maryland where a suspect was arrested because he allegedly plotted to kill Justice Kavanaugh in a murder-suicide. And he was an armed gunman, by the way, who also had a knife. I looked at let me just pull the criminal. What are your thoughts on that, first of all, Libby?
What are my thoughts on that?
Yeah, the arrest of that suspect.
I think that's absolutely insane that the suspect was trying to kill a Supreme Court justice, a sitting Supreme Court justice. There has been a great deal of irresponsibility on the part of many Democratic elected leaders who have said that it is reasonable to go to Supreme Court justices' houses and protest out there. These are the same people, of course, that during the Trump administration said that it was right and just to go after and protest members of employees of that administration wherever you saw them, including at Waffle Houses and things like that. And I think we saw that during the Trump administration, where people who worked in the White House couldn't go out without being protested by far left activists. You had Maxine Waters calling for that. You had, representative from California. You had Nancy Pelosi. You have so many different Democratic leaders saying that it's right to do this, to protest where they're standing, just leading their private lives. And we see this now coming to fruition with the attempted. I think he was charged with attempted murder.
I looked at so this is a picture of the suspect, Nicholas John Rusk. Mm-hmm. I think this is an older photo when he was younger. There's actually very, very little known about him. He had pretty much no internet presence that we know of under his real name. So this is from the criminal complaint. This was written by, I think this is an agent with the FBI. Okay. But I highlighted some parts. So Roscoe told the detective that he was upset about the leak of a recent Supreme Court draft decision regarding the right to abortion, as well as the recent school shooting in Uvalde. Roscoe indicated that he believed the justice that he intended to kill would side with Second Amendment decision that would loosen gun control laws. stated that he began thinking about how to give his life a purpose and decided he would kill the Supreme Court justice after finding the justice's Montgomery County address on the internet. Now, one of the groups that put out a map of where the Supreme Court justices' homes are is Ruth sent us. And nobody's really been calling them out to account, nor has anybody been calling out some of the really abhorrent behavior of people leading essentially mob campaigns outside the family homes of the judges. This is really weird, and weird in the sense that, like, I mean, most Americans don't find these actions weird anymore, given to the political extremism we see every day. But when I explain this to the British or the Europeans, this idea that you would organize a group to go to try to intimidate judges at their family homes, like that's not how liberty functions.
Yeah, it's not. It's also interesting because it's not that they're organizing a group; it's that they're organizing anyone who wants to jump on board, which gives them plausible deniability.
Yeah, so in this connection, by the way, to this sort of the Antifa tactics of being loosely organized, one of the groups that has popped up is calling itself Jane's Revenge. Now, they first carried out a attempted firebombing that destroyed the office of a pro-life, pro-family group in Wisconsin, and then they released a manifesto slash statement of claiming responsibility. They promised an escalation in violence, and this is what's notable about that statement also is that they essentially also call for autonomous actions of people who will self-identify with the group. So I've compared Antifa quite often to ISIS, in the fact that ISIS does have a member, like those who are members, by those who actually, let's say, went to ISIS territory in Syria or Iraq to like live under the caliphate. There's that. So, and analogous to that are those who are actually members of Antifa cells where they go to meetings. And you can read about that in my book, by the way. But there's also those who carry out attacks in the name of ISIS. So we've experienced across Western Europe, also in the United States, those people who never went to Syria or Iraq, and all they did was read the propaganda or watched the videos and was inspired and took action. And this is a tactic of what a lot of the Antifa violent extremists do. Now we're seeing also with this Jane's Revenge group, they've carried out a number of attacks, and it doesn't really get much attention. So there was an attack on June 7th in Buffalo, New York, where there was an actual firebombing. So this is the Office of Campus Care, by the way. So you can see it was completely destroyed. They broke in. And they've been leaving these messages that are really disturbing and scary. Jane was here. They also write, another one of their slogans is, if abortions aren't safe, then neither are you.
Neither are you, yeah.
So that happened in Buffalo, New York. There was also Hollywood, California, Asheville, North Carolina. I'm going to pull up some pictures from that one. So this is happening all over the U.S. from coast to coast, north to the south. Let's see, here we go. So this is Asheville, North Carolina, and the Post Millennial also has a story about it. So you can see they do all this red paint, right? It's meant to intimidate those who work here in the community. It looks like blood. It's completely destroyed the building. If abortions aren't safe, neither of you. And notice on a lot of his graffitis, there's the A anarchist symbol. So this is an Antifa adjacent type group. The blog site that published the claim of responsibility also publishes a lot of Antifa propaganda. And then the newest incident that happened was just today, or early today, or last night, in Vancouver, Washington, which is right next to Portland. Antifa from Portland have gone there to riot. None of these attacks get the national attention.
I think part of that is that we don't see. There is obviously the issue of there not being extensive reporting on leftist violence, but also without a leader and without there being a group that is taking responsibility, it's hard to know where to focus.
For me to, if there was something like this that was happening on the right, like let's say some far right group released statement of responsibility, called for attacks, and then there were attacks across the country that used logos and symbols,
that's true, yeah.
it would be responded.
Look how nuts they've gone with QAnon, even though nobody on the right even has any idea what they're talking about.
You're right. They do. They have the left upplays the. I mean, yeah, they upplay they make up or upplay the threat coming from the right, and then downplay and or ignore when their side carries out violence. That's their MO. The response is, these are photos from the attack in Hollywood, California. So abortion bans are fascist. Look at all these symbols. A symbols abolish the system. So, and they're going after, by the way, or pregnancy centers and religious institutions that have nothing to do with the Supreme Court. Right. So these are, these are like a form of terrorist attacks. They're going after civilian institutions.
Yes, that's right. And they're going after places that are trying to help women have their children.
Yeah, and if you read in my tweets and messaging about this stuff, I explicitly call these groups pro-abortion rather than pro-choice, because they're carrying out attacks on places that are giving women the choice to.
Did you see Reuters had written about this? And they had put up a tweet saying that pro-abortion activists had carried out these attacks. And then they pulled the tweet and reposted it saying, we deleted the previous tweet because it wasn't pro-abortion activists, it was pro-choice activists. We ran a story on that. I think it was yesterday.
Yeah, the capture of language is really important. I mean, Antifa calling, the press calling them anti-fascist groups, anti-racist groups. It completely, it's how you can kind of, particularly if that propaganda is systematic, you can really brainwash an entire society to be deluded.
Because what happens is people hear those words, they think they know what they mean, and so they assume that the groups are aligned with their own values, when really the words and the language are being used to make it more difficult to understand what it is that they're doing.
So I just wanted to get to some of the questions and comments. Thank you for those who sent them in. Username Tatiana asked, how do we get DAs? We talked a lot about the DAs. I have really underestimated the importance of getting involved in politics locally. Like most people, I think he didn't really care about elections unless maybe if it was every 4 years for a presidential election. But how would you answer?
Yeah, I get a recall petition going. Get some funding from Conservative PAC and get it started. But I do think that a key thing is to know who is running in your local elections and to try not to vote for these people in the first place. How often do you go out and vote in the DA election, or vote even for city council, or vote for the school board? Probably most people don't. And in fact, the people running these campaigns and these elections count on us not going out and voting and not knowing who to vote for. They count on that fully. So it behooves us to educate ourselves. Also, if you have the wherewithal and the interest, you can run for office yourself. You can get backing, you can collect signatures, and you can do that. You probably can't be DA unless you're an attorney and have that whole thing set up, but you could run for city council for sure.
Branahar, this person wrote, leftists are being very quiet at who's doing all the Asian attacks. Do you think do leftists, are they uncomfortable when it is other ethnic minorities carrying out violence against ethnic minorities?
Yes, they're comfortable with that because it disrupts their entire view of the pure, naive, innocent minorities, right? Because that's what the left count on. They say all of these minorities are oppressed and beautiful and perfect.
It's a form of
racism.
Yeah, that
to believe
savage type
yes, it's a
of
noble savage thing.
right.
And I think the left is very uncomfortable with that. So they don't like to see that and they don't talk about it very much. We heard more about the shooter than we did about the subway shooter in New York City, even though both were ideologically driven, essentially racially motivated attacks.
Risa, New York wrote, "I used to walk home at 3 a.m. alone now." So that's echoing what you say.
It's not possible now. I used to as well. Happily, it's gorgeous. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful city.
Owen wrote, "I used to live in Philly. As a European, I was shocked at how the mentally ill are just allowed to roam the city."
That's correct. Actually, very interestingly, Jack Posobiec of Human Events Daily was talking about that. He grew up near Philadelphia, and he had people in his family who were working in a mental hospital, and he saw that mental hospital, that facility, begin to just be dismantled in the 1990s, and people just let out, and they were just wandering around.
I notice a lot of liberals will often blame that the lack of funding for mental health care, but in Portland, so much taxpayer, in other Democrat-run blue cities, so much public money is spent to address the various issues related to homelessness, shelters, all the hiring of all these mental health experts, social workers, and I'm not blaming that for the explosion in the presence of visible homelessness in Portland, but it hasn't alleviated any of the issues. Portland, like San Francisco, like many liberal urban areas in the United States, you just see this homeless encampments all over, like streets and nearby parks, residential areas. And if you do any organizing to try to pressure the mayor or the city council to do something about clearing some of these areas that are nearby schools, and by the way, it's not you're then blamed by the left-wing militant housing activists as being anti-poverty, or not anti against people who are poor, demonizing the homeless, wanting to make them suffer. But if you walk through any of these homeless encampments, and if you haven't done it, you should, just so you can see what you see in these areas are discarded hypodermic needles all over the ground. You see human waste. It's dangerous for the people who live there. It's dangerous for people who live around there. And it's so... there's like this possession on this lobby, this leftist lobby that just... they... I used to think that it didn't make sense. Why do they want to defend policies that would allow this or call for the ignoring of law enforcement when these housing encampments are illegal? And in fact, with some of the most militant ideologues who are insupportable, that if you actually look at their writings and their propaganda and the literature, they actually, there's a reasoning behind it, and it's the reasoning behind why Antifa seek to destroy the communities where they live. Mm-hmm. It's because they view capitalism as the enemy, and that these places that have benefited economically from what they say is gentrification, therefore these acts that cause property values to go down, the quality of life to go down, is sort of an act of revenge, and an act of revenge against capitalism, a sabotage.
That's an interesting idea. I know in New York they've started clearing homeless encampments. They're just like, you're not doing this now. We're done.
Do you think that's because of... New York also has a lot of wealthy people. Do you think it's
a lot of wealthy people?
Is it because of that? Those who represent their interests?
That's possible. We need wealthy people in New York. We need them to come in and pay taxes and go to all of the galas and, spread around all the wealth for the rest of us so that we all get nice parks in our neighborhood. We all need that. So that's definitely a thing. We need the wealthy in New York. Every big city really needs a lot of wealthy people, and when they start to leave, that turns into a problem. Michael Bloomberg, one of the interesting things about when he was mayor, I always noticed when there was a budget shortfall, sort of off topic, but when there was a budget shortfall, for example, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art wouldn't get enough money, suddenly there would be some like $5 million anonymous donation to the Met, and it's like, oh, he's paying for it. That's not bad.
This comment from Brandon Hart, I think, is worth mentioning. this person wrote, the FBI has been forced to drop the term Black identity extremist. That was a term, I don't know if it was adopted formally, but in some of the leaked documents from the FBI, that was a term they were, at least within the FBI, was using to identify those who were carrying out violence because of Black identity ideology. And I talked about this in one of my podcasts. We've had a number of attacks, like in Jersey City, those who are connected to Black Hebrew Israelites killing Jewish people. In Dallas a few years ago, in New Orleans a number of years ago, Black identity extremists killing police officers. And they've been, unfortunately, the FBI has been pressured by Democrats in Congress actually to drop using that term. Again, it goes back to this idea that they have a denial that violent extremism exists on their side.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually don't, in my view, don't really care if people are safe or not safe. It's about
power. Yeah, definitely about power.
So thank you everyone for joining in and sending in your questions and comments. This is what you're looking at is my link tree. If you go to linktree/Andy Ngo, you'll see links to my website and ways you can support me on Locals, Patreon, Subscribestar, and you can also give one-time donations on Cash App or Venmo. My username, like on Getter, is at Mr. Andy NGO. I'm able to continue doing this work with the support of you all, so I'm really thankful for that. And Libby, thanks so much for spending your valuable time with me and
Sure.
my audience. And for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you name off the places that they can follow you and read your content?
Oh, well, mostly I'm at the Post Millennial. I cover a lot of work there. And I'm on Twitter at Libby Emmons. That's pretty much it. That's where I am these days.
Okay.
Pretty much all the time.
Well, thank
you. I'm awake.
She works really hard, everyone. Give her a follow on social media. It's the least you can do. And read my new report on the Post Millennial. I posted it on my Get Her. Well, thank you everyone for joining in.